They didn't tell you the truth. They said if you show up consistently, give your time, your attention, your loyalty, if you stay open, available, understanding, people will respect you, they'll value you, they'll choose you. But reality feels different. The more you give, the less it seems to matter. The more present you are, the easier it becomes to overlook you. And somewhere in that quiet shift, something begins to crack. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough to make you question what you believed. There's a reason for that. Human nature doesn't hold on to what is always there. It drifts toward what feels uncertain, what feels like it could disappear. As Epictetus taught, control lies not in what is given freely, but in what is chosen. And when your presence is no longer governed, it loses its weight. But when it becomes deliberate, it begins to mean something again. There's a quiet shift that happens when something becomes constant. It doesn't lose its value, it loses its impact. The mind adapts quickly, faster than most people notice. What once felt rare becomes normal, and what feels normal eventually becomes invisible. Not because it no longer matters, but because it no longer demands attention. Value is not just about what exists, it's about what is felt. And when your presence becomes predictable, it stops being felt in the same way. This doesn't just apply to things, it applies even more to attention, energy, and emotional availability. When something is always accessible, the mind stops registering it as significant. It stops asking questions, it stops leaning in. Certainty replaces curiosity, and over time, certainty erases appreciation. That's why effort alone doesn't guarantee recognition. You can give more, show up more, offer more, and still feel overlooked. Not because you lack value, but because your value has become familiar. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "What we do now echoes in eternity, yet even something meaningful can lose its echo in the present when it is given without awareness." When actions are constant and unmeasured, they blend into routine, and routine rarely captures attention. This is where a subtle truth appears. Value is not just in what you give, but in how it is experienced. And experience is shaped by contrast, by variation, by the presence of absence. At first, consistency feels like strength, and in many ways it is. But consistency without boundaries becomes predictability, and predictability removes tension. Without tension, there is no curiosity. Without curiosity, there is no focus. The mind drifts toward what feels uncertain, what feels incomplete, what feels like it could change. This isn't manipulation, it's simply how attention works. It moves toward what is not fully understood. Think about how quickly patterns form. A message always answered immediately becomes expected. Attention always given becomes assumed. Emotional support always available becomes taken for granted. None of this happens intentionally. It happens gradually, almost invisibly, and by the time it's noticed, the dynamic has already shifted. What once felt appreciated now feels overlooked, and the instinct is to give more, to fix it. But giving more in the same pattern only deepens the problem. The mind doesn't measure value by effort, it measures it by contrast. Something that appears and disappears carries more weight than something that is always there. Not because it is better, but because it creates space. And in that space, awareness returns. Without space, everything blends together, no matter how meaningful it once was. Epictetus made this clear in a different way. He who is not a good servant will not be a good master. Control begins internally, not externally. When your presence is given without restraint, it becomes reactive. And anything reactive eventually loses direction. This is where many people lose their influence, not because they lack value, but because they've stopped directing where their energy goes. There's no need for extremes here, no dramatic withdrawal, no forced distance. The shift begins with awareness, noticing where your presence has become automatic, noticing where your attention is given without intention. Because once something is given unconsciously, it loses weight. But when it is chosen, deliberately, even in small ways, it begins to matter again. It's easy to confuse constant presence with importance, but importance is not measured by frequency, it's measured by depth, and depth requires space. Moments where something is not instantly available, not immediately given, not entirely predictable. That's where attention sharpens, that's where perception changes. So the question is not how much you give, it's how it is experienced, because something can exist in abundance and still feel scarce when it is controlled. And something can exist in abundance and feel invisible when it is not. The difference is not quantity, it's awareness. This is where quiet discipline reshapes everything. Not by giving less, but by giving with intention, by allowing your presence to carry meaning instead of just frequency. And over time, that shift changes how you are perceived. Not through force, not through explanation, but through something much simpler. What is not constant is noticed, and what is noticed begins to matter again. The change itself is subtle, it doesn't announce itself, it doesn't demand attention, it simply alters the rhythm, a slight delay, a calmer response, a moment of silence where there was once immediacy. And the mind notices. It always does, because when a pattern breaks, even slightly, attention returns. Patterns allow people to relax around you. They make you predictable, easy to read, easy to understand. But when that pattern shifts, even just a little, something changes. The mind starts observing again. It starts paying attention in a way it didn't before. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because something is no longer certain. And that's where everything begins to shift. Not because you tried to control the outcome, but because you stopped making yourself completely predictable. You stopped being automatic. You became intentional. If this changed the way you see your own presence, even slightly, then stay close to ideas that sharpen awareness and refine how you move through the world. Take a moment to subscribe, not out of habit, but as a quiet decision to think more clearly, act more deliberately, and understand what truly holds value. This is where the shift begins, not by removing yourself entirely, but by altering the rhythm. A slight delay where there was once immediacy, a calm response where there was once predictable emotion, a moment of silence where there was once constant engagement. These are small changes, but they carry disproportionate impact, because the mind is highly sensitive to disruption. It notices when something familiar becomes uncertain. It reacts when patterns break, not because the change is dramatic, but because it interrupts expectation. Seneca once wrote, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." But there is another layer to this idea. Attention follows what feels uncertain. When everything is expected, there is no opportunity for attention to grow. It stays flat, predictable, unremarkable. But the moment expectation is interrupted, even slightly, the mind shifts. It leans in. It starts observing again. That's not manipulation. It's simply the nature of focus. The mistake most people make is thinking they need to do more to regain attention. More effort, more presence, more explanation. But more of the same pattern only reinforces predictability, and predictability removes curiosity. When nothing changes, nothing stands out. So the real shift is not about adding, it's about adjusting, about creating just enough variation to break the automatic flow. This doesn't mean becoming inconsistent in a chaotic way. It's not about randomness or confusion. It's about controlled unpredictability, a kind of presence that feels steady but not fully readable. Because when someone can't fully predict you, they can't fully relax around you. And when they can't relax, they pay attention. Their mind starts filling in gaps, trying to understand what changed, what it means, what comes next. That mental engagement is what was missing before. There's a quiet discipline required here. It's not about reacting differently because of emotion. It's about choosing responses with intention. That difference matters more than it seems. When behavior shifts from reaction to decision, it carries a different energy. It feels grounded, not impulsive. And that grounded presence is harder to ignore because it doesn't follow the same predictable script. Carl Jung once observed, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Patterns operate in that unconscious space. They guide behavior without being questioned, but the moment they are seen, they can be changed. And that change doesn't require force. It requires awareness. Noticing where behavior has become automatic, where responses are no longer chosen but expected. As that awareness grows, something subtle begins to shift. You start to notice how small changes create different reactions, how a delayed response draws more attention than an immediate one, how silence can create more curiosity than explanation, how calmness can disrupt expectations more than emotional reactions. These are not tricks, they are reflections of how the mind processes uncertainty. And uncertainty, when used with control, becomes a powerful force. It doesn't need to be exaggerated. It doesn't need to be obvious. In fact, the less visible it is, the stronger its effect. Because the mind doesn't react as strongly to what it understands as it does to what it cannot fully explain. That's where attention deepens. That's where focus returns. There's also a deeper shift happening beneath all of this. It's not just about how others perceive you. It's about how you relate to your own behavior. When you stop acting out of habit and start acting with intention, you reclaim a level of control that was previously unnoticed. Your presence becomes something you direct, not something that simply happens. And that internal shift changes everything externally without needing to force it. The rhythm changes, and with it, the dynamic changes. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily. Others begin to adjust, often without realizing why. They respond differently because the pattern they relied on is no longer there, and when the pattern disappears, attention replaces it. That's the quiet power of breaking predictability. Not to confuse, not to manipulate, but to restore awareness where it was lost. And once awareness returns, everything feels different. Interactions carry more weight. Presence feels more intentional. Responses feel more considered. Not because anything extreme was done, but because something subtle was changed. The rhythm is no longer automatic, it's deliberate. And that difference, though small on the surface, reshapes how everything is experienced. The moment something changes, even slightly, the mind reacts. Not loudly, not always consciously, but it reacts. It begins to search for meaning in the shift. Not because anything was clearly stated, but because something was left unsaid. That absence becomes noticeable. And once it's noticed, it creates a quiet tension. Not the kind that feels chaotic, but the kind that pulls attention inward. The kind that makes the mind pause and start asking questions on its own. This is where most people lose their advantage without realizing it. The moment that tension appears, there is an instinct to resolve it. To explain, to clarify, to fill the silence so nothing is misunderstood. It feels natural, it feels responsible. But in doing that, something important is lost. Because the tension that was beginning to build, the very thing that creates focus, is removed before it has time to develop. The mind no longer needs to search. It no longer needs to engage. Everything is made clear too quickly. Clarity has its place, but when it is given too early, it removes curiosity. And curiosity is what keeps attention alive. When something is incomplete, the mind doesn't let go of it easily. It returns to it. It replays it. It tries to understand it. That process creates depth. It creates a kind of mental investment that doesn't happen when everything is immediately explained. So the question becomes not how to remove tension, but how to allow it to exist without reacting to it. Epictetus once said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." There is a quiet strength in allowing misunderstanding to exist without rushing to correct it. Not every silence needs to be filled. Not every shift needs to be explained. Because the need to explain often comes from discomfort, not necessity. And when actions are driven by discomfort, they lose their grounding. There's something powerful about restraint that often goes unnoticed. It doesn't draw attention to itself, but it changes how everything is perceived. When you don't immediately explain, you create space. And in that space, something begins to form. The other person starts to think. They start to reflect. They start to interpret. And interpretation is far more engaging than being told exactly what to think. The mind doesn't fixate on what is clear. It fixates on what is unresolved. That's why silence can carry more weight than words. Not because silence is inherently powerful, but because it invites thought. It creates a gap. And the mind is wired to fill gaps. It doesn't like uncertainty, so it leans into it, trying to make sense of it. That leaning is where attention grows. But this only works when the silence is real. If the silence is filled with internal anxiety, with waiting, with the need for a reaction, it loses its stability. It becomes fragile, and that fragility can be felt, even if nothing is said. True stillness comes from being at ease with the absence of immediate resolution, from not needing to control how something is perceived in every moment. Carl Jung observed, "The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed." That calm doesn't come from eliminating tension. It comes from learning to sit with it, from recognizing that tension is not always a problem to be solved, but a process to be understood. And when that understanding develops, the urge to react begins to fade. There's also a shift in how silence is viewed. It stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like presence in a different form. A presence that doesn't demand attention, but invites it. A presence that doesn't explain, but allows meaning to form naturally. And that kind of presence carries a different kind of weight. It doesn't rely on constant reinforcement. It holds itself. As this becomes more natural, the need to control every perception begins to loosen. There's less concern about being misunderstood in the moment, and more trust in how things unfold over time, because not everything needs to be clarified immediately. Some things gain clarity through reflection, through distance, through the passage of time, and that clarity tends to be deeper, more stable. There's a quiet discipline in holding that position, in allowing space to remain space, in resisting the urge to step in and fill it. It requires patience, it requires trust. But it also creates a different dynamic, one where attention is not forced but drawn, where focus is not demanded but given freely because something feels unresolved. And that unresolved feeling is not negative, it's what keeps the mind engaged. It's what creates a loop that returns again and again, trying to understand, trying to interpret, trying to make sense of what was not fully explained. That loop is where presence becomes lasting, not because of what was said, but because of what was left open. Over time, this changes how interactions are experienced. There is less urgency, less need to respond immediately, less pressure to clarify everything. And in that reduced urgency, there is more control, more intention, more awareness. Actions are no longer driven by the need to resolve tension, but by the choice to engage when it feels aligned. And that choice carries weight, because it is not automatic, it is deliberate. It reflects a different relationship with silence, with tension, with uncertainty. Not as things to avoid, but as elements that shape perception in subtle but powerful ways. So instead of seeing silence as something empty, it begins to feel like something full of possibility, full of interpretation, full of quiet influence. And when that is understood, the instinct to fill it disappears. Not because it is suppressed, but because it is no longer needed. What remains is a kind of calm presence that doesn't rush, doesn't react, doesn't explain unnecessarily. And in that calm, something shifts. Attention deepens. Focus returns. Not because anything was forced, but because something was allowed to exist just as it is, unfinished, open, and quietly compelling. There's a subtle difference that most people overlook, and it changes everything. Stepping back is not the same as letting go. Creating distance is not the same as detaching. You can be physically absent and still emotionally present in the strongest way, still tied to outcomes, still waiting, still hoping something shifts. And when that happens, nothing truly changes. The surface may look different, but the dynamic underneath remains exactly the same. Because availability is not just about proximity, it's about where your attention lives, where your emotional energy flows, and whether that energy is still dependent on someone else's response. This is where things become uncomfortable, because it forces a deeper level of honesty. It's easy to delay a response, it's easy to appear distant, but it's much harder to remove the internal pull, the part that keeps checking, keeps wondering, keeps waiting for a reaction. That internal attachment is what people sense, even if nothing is said. It shows in small ways, in timing, in tone, in subtle shifts in behavior. And those small signals reveal more than any deliberate action ever could. The Stoic approach cuts through this completely. It doesn't focus on controlling how others respond. It focuses on controlling what is within reach. Your own reactions, your own impulses, your own attention. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That strength isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in restraint, in the ability to pause, in the ability to choose rather than react. And that choice is what separates true distance from performative distance. Because if the mind is still waiting, still seeking, still depending, then nothing has actually been reclaimed. The attention is still external, still tied to someone else's behavior, and as long as that dependency exists, control remains out of reach. It doesn't matter how long the silence lasts or how far the distance extends. Without internal detachment, those actions become fragile. They can break the moment discomfort appears. There's a quiet discipline in redirecting that energy, not suppressing it, not ignoring it, but guiding it, allowing attention to return inward instead of outward, focusing on what is being built, what is being developed, what is within direct control. This is not about becoming indifferent, it's about becoming grounded. Because when attention is grounded, it no longer shifts based on external reactions. Epictetus expressed this clearly when he said, "Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens." That idea removes the need to chase outcomes. It removes the need to monitor reactions. It centers everything on choice. And when choice becomes the foundation, behavior changes naturally, not as a tactic, but as a reflection of internal stability. This is where most people struggle, because it feels unfamiliar. There's a habit of looking outward, of measuring value through response, of adjusting behavior based on feedback. Letting go of that habit creates a kind of emptiness at first, a space where there used to be constant engagement, and that space can feel uncomfortable if it's not understood. But that discomfort is not a sign of loss, it's a sign of transition. As that transition settles, something shifts. The need to check fades, the urge to react softens, the mind becomes quieter, less pulled in different directions, and in that quiet there is clarity. Clarity about what matters, about where energy should go, about what deserves attention and what does not. That clarity creates a different kind of presence, one that is not reactive, not dependent, not easily influenced. And that presence feels different to others, not because it is forced, but because it is steady. It doesn't fluctuate based on immediate circumstances. It doesn't chase. It doesn't seek validation. It simply exists, grounded in its own direction. And that steadiness is difficult to ignore because it breaks the usual pattern of reaction. There's no need to prove anything in that state, no need to demonstrate distance or announce change. The shift is internal first, and the external follows naturally. Behavior becomes more deliberate, responses become more measured, silence becomes more comfortable, and all of it happens without needing to explain or justify it. The question then becomes less about how others perceive the change and more about whether the change is genuine, because genuine change does not rely on outcome. It does not need confirmation. It stands on its own. And when it stands on its own, it becomes stable. It doesn't collapse under pressure or revert when something unexpected happens. This is where real control begins, not in how others respond, but in how you remain unaffected by that response, not in creating distance for effect, but in creating space for clarity. And that clarity allows you to move differently, to choose differently, to engage without losing yourself in the process. Over time, this builds a kind of quiet confidence, not the kind that seeks attention, but the kind that doesn't need it. A confidence rooted in knowing that your attention is your own, your energy is directed, your presence is intentional, and from that place, everything changes, not because you tried to change it, but because you changed what was guiding your actions. So stepping back is not about absence, it's about alignment. It's about making sure that when you move, you're not being pulled, but choosing. And that choice, repeated consistently, becomes the foundation of a presence that is no longer dependent, no longer reactive, and no longer easily overlooked. Something changes the moment behavior is no longer tied to reaction. It becomes quieter, more deliberate, less hurried. There is no rush to respond, no urgency to prove, no impulse to adjust based on what just happened. Instead, there is a pause, a space between what is received and what is given back. And inside that space, intention forms, not as something forced, but as something chosen. That difference is subtle, but it carries weight. Because what is chosen feels steady, while what is reactive feels unstable, even if it looks similar on the surface. When actions come from reaction, they are shaped by external movement. Someone says something, and there is an immediate response. Someone pulls back, and there is an instinct to move closer. Someone becomes distant, and there is a need to close that gap. The entire rhythm becomes dependent on what is happening outside, and over time, that dependency creates a pattern that others can read easily. It becomes predictable, familiar, almost automatic. And once something becomes automatic, it stops being observed closely. But when that pattern is interrupted, not through force, but through awareness, something shifts. Responses slow down, reactions soften. There is no longer a need to match every movement or mirror every change. Instead, there is a quiet consistency that comes from within rather than from outside. And that internal consistency feels different. It doesn't fluctuate with circumstances. It doesn't adjust based on immediate feedback. It holds its own rhythm. Seneca once wrote, "The greatest obstacle to living is expectancy, which hangs upon tomorrow and loses today." When behavior is driven by expectation, waiting for a response, anticipating a reaction, it becomes tied to outcomes that are not within control. But when that expectation is removed, what remains is presence, a kind of presence that is not looking ahead or reacting behind, but existing fully in the moment of choice. And in that state, something interesting begins to happen. Without trying to create distance, distance forms naturally. Without trying to appear different, difference becomes visible, because when behavior is no longer predictable, it becomes difficult to categorize, and when something cannot be easily categorized, the mind becomes engaged. It starts to observe more closely. It starts to pay attention in ways it didn't before. There is a natural pull toward what is not fully understood, not because it is mysterious in an exaggerated way, but because it resists easy explanation. When someone behaves in a way that doesn't follow a clear pattern, it creates a quiet question. Not spoken, not always conscious but present, and that question keeps attention anchored. It invites reflection. It encourages observation. This is not about creating confusion. It's about removing excess clarity, because too much clarity given too quickly leaves no room for thought. It answers questions before they are fully formed. It removes the need to think deeply. And when there is no need to think deeply, attention fades. But when there is a small gap, just enough uncertainty, the mind leans into it. It tries to understand. And that effort creates connection in a way that constant explanation never can. Aristotle noted, "It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it." That space between thought and acceptance is where attention lives. It's where the mind stays active, not settling too quickly, not moving on too fast. And when behavior creates that space naturally, it draws attention without effort. There's also a deeper shift happening beneath all of this. When you stop trying to be understood, you remove a certain kind of pressure. The pressure to explain, to justify, to ensure that every action is interpreted correctly. That pressure often leads to over-communication, to filling gaps that didn't need to be filled. And in doing so, it removes the very thing that creates engagement. Without that pressure, behavior becomes lighter. Not careless, but less burdened by outcome. You respond because it feels aligned, not because it is expected. You engage because it feels right, not because it is required. And that alignment creates a kind of calm presence that doesn't demand attention but naturally holds it. People begin to notice, not because something was announced, but because something feels different. There is less urgency, less predictability, less need to maintain a constant flow. And in that difference, curiosity begins to grow, not forced, not manufactured, but arising from the simple fact that the usual pattern is no longer there. Over time, this changes how interactions unfold. There is more space between actions, more thought behind responses, more awareness in how energy is given. And that awareness creates a rhythm that is not easily matched or mirrored. It becomes its own pattern, one that is not obvious, not repetitive, but consistent in its intentionality. That consistency is what grounds everything, not consistency in behavior, but consistency in awareness, a steady understanding of when to engage, when to step back, when to speak, when to remain silent. And that understanding removes the need to control how others respond, because the focus is no longer on the outcome, but on the integrity of the action itself. And when actions come from that place, they carry a different kind of weight. Not heavy, not forced, but meaningful, because they are not driven by reaction, but by choice. And choice, when repeated with awareness, shapes perception in ways that reaction never can. So the shift is not about becoming distant or unreachable. It's about becoming intentional, about allowing behavior to reflect internal stability rather than external movement. And in doing so, something subtle but powerful emerges. A presence that doesn't need to be explained, doesn't need to be understood immediately, but stays in the mind because it cannot be fully grasped all at once. There comes a point where the shift is no longer about behavior on the surface, but about the standard underneath it. Not a tactic, not something applied temporarily, but something that becomes part of how you move. Emotional scarcity begins here, and it doesn't mean withdrawing care or becoming distant in a cold way. It means becoming deliberate. You still feel, still engage, still connect, but not automatically, not endlessly, and not without awareness of where your energy is going. That awareness changes the entire dynamic, because what is given consciously carries more weight than what is given out of habit. When something is always available, it stops being evaluated. It becomes assumed. But when something is selective, it stands out. It is noticed. It creates a moment of pause. And in that pause, value begins to form again. Not because anything new was added, but because something was refined. Energy is no longer scattered. It is directed. and directed energy feels different. It has presence, it has intention, it has meaning behind it. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." That idea carries into this space in a quiet way. It's not about explaining your value or proving it through constant engagement. It's about embodying a standard that naturally limits where your energy goes. Not everyone receives the same level of attention. Not every moment requires a response, and that restraint is not weakness. It is clarity. At first, this kind of selectiveness can feel unfamiliar. There is a tendency to equate constant presence with care, to believe that always being there is what maintains connection. But over time, that constant presence can blur into the background. It becomes expected rather than appreciated. And when something becomes expected, it loses its impact. Not because it has no value, but because it is no longer being noticed in the same way. There's a shift in perception when availability is no longer guaranteed. The mind becomes more attentive. It begins to observe more closely. Small changes are noticed. Moments of presence carry more meaning because they are not constant, they are chosen. And that choice creates a different kind of engagement, one that feels intentional rather than automatic. Carl Jung once observed, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Part of that process is recognizing where energy has been given without thought, where behavior has been shaped by expectation rather than choice. And once that recognition happens, there is an opportunity to realign, not by withdrawing completely, but by becoming more aware of how and when you engage. This awareness brings a kind of calm control. There is less urgency to respond immediately, less pressure to maintain constant interaction, less need to fill every silence. Instead, there is space. And in that space, decisions become clearer. You engage when it feels aligned, not when it is expected. You respond when it feels meaningful, not when it is automatic. And that difference is felt, not always consciously, but consistently, because when something is no longer constant, it becomes something to notice again. It creates a subtle sense of uncertainty, not in a negative way, but in a way that draws attention. The mind begins to question, to observe, to stay engaged, and that engagement is what was missing before. There's no need to force this, no need to create artificial distance or calculated absence. Emotional scarcity is not about withholding for effect. It is about aligning behavior with intention, about making sure that what is given is chosen, not reflexive. And when that alignment becomes consistent, it reshapes how everything is perceived. Over time, this creates a different kind of presence, one that is not overwhelming, not constant, but steady in its selectiveness. A presence that doesn't seek attention, but naturally holds it because it is not always there. It appears, it engages, and then it steps back. And in that stepping back, something remains, a sense of weight, a sense of meaning, a sense of value that lingers beyond the moment itself. There's also a shift internally. Less energy is spent maintaining patterns that no longer serve. Less attention is given to external reactions. More focus is placed on what feels aligned, what feels grounded, what feels intentional. And that internal shift supports everything else. Because when energy is not scattered, it becomes stronger. It becomes more focused. It becomes more effective without needing to increase effort. And that's where the real change happens. Not in how much is given, but in how it is given. Not in how often you are present, but in how that presence is experienced. Because when something is no longer guaranteed, it becomes something to appreciate again. Something to notice. Something to value. So the question is not about reducing care or limiting connection. It's about refining it. About making sure that what is given carries meaning, carries intention, carries weight. Because when it does, it no longer fades into the background. It stands out. It leaves an impression. And that impression stays, not because it was constant, but because it was chosen. At some point, the focus shifts in a way that feels almost unfamiliar. What once revolved around reactions, responses, and outcomes begins to turn inward, not in a withdrawn or isolated way, but in a grounded way. A way that is no longer dependent on what happens next. Because as long as there is a need for a reaction, there is still a connection to something outside of your control. And that connection, even when subtle, shapes behavior. It influences timing, tone, and decision-making in ways that are not always obvious. The deeper shift happens when that need begins to loosen. Not forced, not suppressed, but understood. You start to see how much of your energy was tied to something external, waiting, checking, interpreting, adjusting. And once you see it clearly, it becomes easier to step out of it, not completely at once, but gradually. With awareness, with intention. And with that shift, something changes internally before anything changes externally. Epictetus once said, "Don't seek for events to happen as you wish, but wish for events to happen as they do happen, and your life will go smoothly." That idea isn't passive, it's stabilizing. It removes the constant friction that comes from trying to control outcomes. It allows you to act without being tied to what follows. And that separation creates a different kind of clarity. One that is not clouded by expectation or need. When actions are no longer tied to outcomes, they become cleaner, more precise. You respond because it feels aligned, not because you are hoping for a specific reaction. You step back because it feels right, not because you are trying to create distance. And that difference, though subtle, is what gives your behavior weight. Because it is not driven by lack, it is driven by choice. There is a calm that comes with this, not a passive calm, but a steady one. A kind of internal stillness that doesn't fluctuate based on what happens externally. And that stillness changes how everything is experienced. There is less urgency, less need to interpret every action, less pressure to respond immediately. Instead, there is space. And in that space, there is control. This is where silence stops being a tool and becomes a natural state. It is no longer something you use to create an effect. It is something that simply exists because there is nothing that needs to be said in that moment. There is no discomfort in it, no urge to fill it. And that kind of silence carries a different presence. It feels grounded, not forced. Marcus Aurelius reflected this idea when he wrote, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." That retreat is not about escaping the world. It is about finding stability within it. And when that stability is present, external dynamics lose their hold. They no longer dictate behavior. They no longer pull attention in different directions. This doesn't mean detachment in a cold or distant sense. It means engagement without dependence. Being present without being controlled by presence. It means you can care without losing your center. You can engage without needing the outcome to validate the action. And that balance is what creates real strength. There's also a shift in how value is experienced. It is no longer something that needs to be proven or reinforced through constant interaction. It becomes something that is understood internally. And because it is understood internally, it no longer needs to be displayed externally in the same way. There is less need to show, to explain, to demonstrate. Over time, this creates a presence that feels different to others. Not because it is trying to be different, but because it is no longer reacting in the usual ways. There is less predictability, less urgency, less need for constant engagement. And that difference draws attention naturally. Not because it demands it, but because it stands apart from what is expected. The dynamic changes, but not through effort. It changes because the foundation has changed. The focus is no longer on managing perception or creating a specific response. It is on maintaining alignment, on acting in a way that reflects internal stability rather than external influence. And when that alignment is consistent, it becomes visible. not in a dramatic way, but in a steady one. In how you respond, in how you move, in how you engage. There is a sense of control, not over others, but over yourself. And that control is what shapes everything else. There is no longer a need to chase attention, because attention begins to come naturally. There is no longer a need to create distance, because space forms on its own. There is no longer a need to explain, because actions speak with clarity that words often cannot reach. This is where everything settles into place. Not perfectly, not without challenges, but with a sense of direction that is no longer dependent on what happens outside. And from that place, presence becomes something different. Not something that is given freely without thought, but something that is chosen with awareness. And when presence is chosen, it carries weight. It feels intentional. It leaves an impression that lasts beyond the moment, not because it was constant, but because it was grounded. Because it came from a place that does not shift easily. So, eventually, the focus returns fully to where it always needed to be. Not on how others respond, not on what they think, not on what they do next, but on how you move, how you choose, how you remain steady regardless of what unfolds. And in that steadiness, something becomes clear. Your presence has the most impact when it is no longer driven by need, but by quiet, deliberate control. In the end, nothing changes more than the moment you stop chasing what cannot be controlled. When your presence is no longer driven by need, it becomes something rare, something steady, something that leaves an impact without trying. That's where real power begins, not in what you say, not in what you show, but in what you choose to hold back. If this shifted something in you, don't let it fade here. There's another video on your screen that goes deeper into this path. Watch it and keep building that quiet strength.